Hello and welcome to another installment of my Dostoevsky series. Today I'll be talking about Notes from Underground, which was published in 1864. Specifically, I'll be giving historical context and key literary details and philosophical cues that I think it would benefit you to be mindful of before you read. All right, so this is a narrative of confession. That means we need to keep in mind who is confessing, to whom, what is the purpose of their confession, and when are they making this confession. Now, the confessional genre immediately evokes Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but the underground man, what his main problem is that he is hyper-conscious. He suffers from a heightened awareness of himself, and this is a problem because it inhibits him from taking action. The only personal detail we find out about the protagonist in part one is that he is extremely ill. He says, "I'm a sick man, I'm a wicked man." So he's both physically ill and also mentally. Now the structure, the novella is broken into two parts. So part one is it possesses a conversational tone. It's the stream of consciousness of the narrator, whereas part two follows a more traditional narrative structure. We have a plot, characters, dialogue, so on. What I find fascinating about this is that Dostoevsky creates a fatalistic structure because it goes in a cycle. So in part one, we find out the kind of theory that the underground man believes in about life and his ideas. And part two, we see how they get put into practice. But part two actually takes place in the 1840s, while part one takes place in the 1860s. So that would be contemporary time. And by having this kind of structure, we get to see what it means to put one's ideals into practice. And I just encourage readers to not get discouraged by part one. If you're somebody like me who kind of hates this sort of stream of consciousness writing style, just be mindful that things become much, much clearer in part two. All right, so one key detail about narration here is that our protagonist is constantly anticipating a response from his audience, who's unnamed, by the way. It's left open-ended, but you can kind of interpret the audience as his ideological opponent. So he knows that there are issues with the things he's saying, so he anticipates responses, corrects himself, and this kind of ever-changing discourse makes it extremely, actually impossible to define him. Now, something I've noticed that a lot of people miss when talking about this novella is that it was actually written as a response to Nikolai Chernyshevsky's book called What Is to Be Done, not to be confused with Lenin's What Is to Be Done. Now, you cannot underestimate the significance this book had on the Russian Empire, on everyone. Like, this book, people don't talk about it a ton because it's not very literary, so to speak. Okay, I'm not gonna get sidetracked. Essentially, in this novel, Chernyshevsky, his ideology is that of rational egoism or rational utilitarianism. And this is essentially the belief that in a rational society, doing what's best for yourself ultimately contributes to the greater good. And then the utilitarianism part of it is that any action taken should bring about the greatest possible good for the largest amount of people. And so Dostoevsky critiques the notion that human behavior can be wholly guided by reason, by showing us this highly irrational protagonist. And he disputes that this sort of like collective happiness that Chernyshevsky posits in his book as belonging to a rational society, so to speak, is either A, achievable, or B, desirable. Ways that he criticizes this book are through the protagonist, as I already mentioned, but also through this imagery or symbolism of the Crystal Palace. This is a symbol of the pinnacle of enlightened reasoning, and that's why our protagonist kind of scoffs at it and dismisses it. There's also, Dostoevsky includes a duel in his book, which is a hilarious moment in part 2, because rather than kind of a traditional duel with pistols, the protagonist has a bumping duel where he just essentially bumps into a stranger on the street and they keep bumping into each other, and it's just comical. And the last way is through the protagonist's attempt to rescue a fallen woman, which really just means prostitute. So all of this comes back to Chernyshevsky, comes back to what is to be done. Another famous writer who responded to this book was Ivan Turgenev, and he did that through his novel Fathers and Sons. Lastly, Dostoevsky also critiques scientific determinism, the idea that everything can be understood through the lens of science. So, the underground man is the archetypal radical nihilist. He is guided by a spirit of perversity, and he's basically the opposite of logic. You think, okay, I want this outcome, I'm going to go about it this way, and the underground man just does the complete opposite. So he is obsessed with proving his dominance. At the heart of Dostoevsky's novel are always these power dynamics. But what's interesting about the underground man is that at the very same time, he needs other people to assert his own selfhood. He possesses this inherent need to be seen and recognized, but unfortunately this forces him to act in a way that actually alienates him from those around him. He actually actively seeks to gain others' contempt, because at least this means that they notice him. And in this sense, he's a bit of a tragic figure. At the heart of this novel, or novella, is this idea of freedom against systemization, against ideas that seek to reduce human lives to mere statistics. Some parting words of advice that I'll give you all is that some people really click with this novel and identify with the protagonist's sense of alienation and depression. Now, I was not one of those people. I read this book probably even before my studies, and I hated it the first time. I don't even think I made it to part 2. But all that is to say is that sometimes classics gain these reputations for being these incredibly moving, influential stories, and that is true, but that doesn't mean everybody's going to identify with it. Nevertheless, I think you should read Notes from Underground just for its fascinating narrative structure, and just as an introduction to Russian literature and culture, because as I pointed out, this book is a response to something that was highly influential in Russian society and also integral to revolutions to come. All right, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and thanks so much for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.